All right, guys. Well, welcome back. I hope you guys had a good Easter holiday and hopefully got a nice break away from the academics. But I'm going to go ahead and start picking it back up. So, where we left off last time was the German defeat at Stalingrad. Pretty massive defeat. Germans lost an entire army, over 300,000 men. Massive. And a lot of it had to do with Hitler's pride. Um, and it's just he's really where he's starting to kind of fall apart, and there's a reason for that that we'll talk about in a little bit. So, what has happened up to this point? So, just even though we've talked about Stalingrad, I want you to know that there's a lot of stuff that's going on at this time. The Allies are engaged in fights all over the world. So the Marines, the U.S. Marines, are in the Pacific. We've got the Allies, the Soviets that are fighting on the Eastern Front, and the British and the Americans are fighting in North Africa and Italy. So there's a lot that's going on, even before Stalingrad, that we're going to kind of touch on in this lead up to D-Day. So, as I said, the Americans are tear through North Africa. They're led by a general named George S. Patton, who's kind of like this tough, hard knocks, rough and tumble type of general. And he's going up against Erwin Rommel in North Africa, who's the German general who's known as the Desert Fox. And Erwin Rommel was instrumental in tank warfare. I mean, he was just absolutely brilliant. And he was continuously giving the British troops and American troops the runaround. Well, Patton had studied all about Rommel. He had read his books on tank warfare and everything, and he was able to use what he learned from how Rommel operated to actually defeat Rommel. So they get the Nazis out of North Africa. They go into Italy until they get to a point where they more or less get trapped by the Germans. It really just becomes kind of a stalemate. No one's really able to advance. And this kind of allows the Americans and the Russians to put pressure on Churchill to open up a new front. And we'll touch on that in just a second. So Hitler knows that an assault is coming. He knows it's imminent. He just doesn't know when. So in order to help prevent this, he creates this Atlantic Wall. And it's a massive chain of fortifications, trenches, all interlocking, artillery, big naval guns, as you can see in the picture, machine gun nests, beach defenses, mines, all kinds of things to make it very, very difficult for an Allied landing to be possible. And in 1943, Allies try to seize the French port town of Dieppe, and they send 6,000 Canadians into this town, and the Canadians get absolutely massacred. There's a real, I guess, confusion that it's like, oh my gosh, it seems like the Germans already knew we were coming. Well, they did actually, because the Canadians, as they were moving their ships into land, got into a short naval skirmish with some German boats in the area, and the German ships were able to alert the defenses at Dieppe, and the Canadians just got torn apart. So lessons are being learned that if an attack is going to happen, the British and Canadians can't do it by themselves. They have to have the American support. They have to have the finances of the Americans, plus the additional troops. They really need the Americans to help pack that much needed punch. And they also know that if it's going to be successful, it has to be surprise. It can't be leaked out. The Germans can't know what's going to happen because they'll just tear it apart. So in 1943, with the German defeat at Stalingrad, President Roosevelt and Stalin, again, like I just said, they put pressure on Winston Churchill to open up a Western Front. And so Churchill didn't really want to do that. He was reluctant. Churchill had basically been the mastermind of two massively failed invasions. In World War I, many of the sophomores, I think we've touched on this. In World War I, he was instrumental as almost kind of like the Secretary of the Navy kind of thing and setting up an amphibious invasion into Turkey, into Gallipoli, Turkey, in order to knock the Turks out of the war and come in from the east. That was the plan. Well, it failed miserably, and he lost over 58,000 men. He felt so bad about that he stepped down from the Navy and thought that he should go fight in the trenches with the men. And then, on top of that, to be kind of involved with the decision making to send the Canadian troops into Dieppe, and see that failed miserably. He's a little bit shaken. He's kind of a head case at this point. He doesn't really think that this is a good idea, but with the Americans and the Russians pushing it, he finally decides to go forth with it and agrees. So the Germans, again, they know it's imminent. They just don't know where. Now, the one thing that they do have in their favor is the weather. The tides and the way they work in the English Channel mean that the tides on the French coast will be at their lowest during the month of June. And so they kind of piece together around when an invasion is going to happen. Again, just don't know where. It's a massive coastline they're trying to defend. So, in order to make sure that the defenses are up to snuff and done correctly, Hitler puts Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, into a position to lead the entire D-Day operation. Defensively, he's in charge of making sure all the defenses are set up, and when he gets there, he actually feels like they need more, so he starts putting more. And Rommel is kind of like getting that superstar transfer into your program and as an athlete, because he completely changes morale for the troops. They feel like they're invincible because they have him, and he's like that rock star. The Allies decide to go ahead and start bombing, and so they start bombing cities inland off the coast, so to make it harder for German troops to reinforce positions where they decide to attack. Again, still kind of keeping their cards close to their chest. They don't want to bomb one area primarily and forget about the other ones, because then that kind of shows your hand. So you got to bomb them all equally, so that the Germans are kind of like, well, we still don't really know where they're going. So to give you the size and scale of D-Day, there are 6,500 ships, 4,000 landing craft, 12,000 aircraft, 2 million Allied troops, and 3,000 tanks. It is the largest amphibious invasion in history and still is today. I think that's why it gets so much attention. The Allies have put in a centralized command, and despite all this, there's still a lot of issues with it, and we'll talk about that when the Battle of the Bulge comes. In charge of the entire operation, everybody in the Allies are under the U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He is going to eventually become a president after World War II, but right now he's the general of the entire Allied force. Right up underneath him he's a unique character. He's the British general. His name is Bernard Montgomery, and he's kind of a character. And I guess the best way to put it is he's a tool. Where most of the Allied generals kind of feel, or the British generals feel like it's really necessary to work with the Americans, he doesn't. He criticizes the Americans at every turn. He's always trying to steal glory from the Americans. He doesn't really care. He's not very empathetic, so he doesn't really care for the struggles of his troops. So he's just a tool. He just doesn't care about anybody. He kind of sees himself as a figurehead. But regardless, he is the commander of all the land forces. Now, as the Allied bombings continue, now they start targeting radar stations, and this is pretty much a repeat. I think this paragraph is kind of a repeat of the last one, is that they're all bombing these specific points. Number one, radar stations, so that the Germans don't know where they're coming. Supply depots, train stations, railroads, etc., so that you can't supply it. If these roads are torn apart and I've got a tank battalion, it's really difficult for me to get to you and help fend that situation off. And that's really where the Germans were hoping to win the battle, and probably could have, had it worked out in their favor, if the Germans would have been able to reinforce they would have won. The whole point was that their forces that were on the beach were there to hold it long enough for reinforcements to get there. So the Germans start intercepting a lot of radio traffic, basically confirming what they thought was that the Allies were going to attack at the Pas de Calais. Now, again, looking at the map, if you look at the Pas de Calais, it is the closest point. So it makes sense that if there's going to be a sea invasion, it's got to be there. It's the shortest route. The Allies know it. The Germans know it. Well, the Allies take advantage of this, and it's probably one of the greatest military operations of deception since the Trojan horse. They create a dummy military, and it's headed by George Patton. He's got troops, he's got barracks, and he's got inflatable tanks. Now, you're not using these for combat, but all they would do is they would kind of stack them around in different places, and when the Germans would fly over to recon to see where the Allied troops were building up, they would see all this. And from the air, these things look pretty realistic. And so they would report back that there were troops building up outside of Dover, which would keep German defenses and reinforcements more geared to the Pas de Calais. And then the next day, they would wake up and they'd move them. They'd move the tanks. They'd move the artillery. They'd have men walking around. So it made it seem like this is a legit operation that they were about to undertake into invade the Pas de Calais. What they didn't know, and probably the harder part for the Germans, they had kind of lost air superiority by this point. And because of that, they couldn't see along the southern coast where Portsmouth is and things like that. Had they been able to get over there, they would have seen that that was where the main buildup of forces were. But because the Allies had already, kind of taken the air away from the Germans, there really was no way for them to see all that. So they're basing everything off of these balloons that they don't know are balloons. The other thing that's working to the Allies' favor, is the German spy network. The Germans thought they had spies working for him. Hitler thought he had some pretty loyal spies. But every spy that had been working for him in Britain had been turned. So now they were double agents. So they would act like they were for Germany when really they were telling lies to Germany to help the British out. So it's kind of weird how all this works out, but in a way, there's a little strokes of luck that are happening. We talked about the Allied air superiority, and the French ties more or less are going to dictate when this invasion is going to happen. So on the night of June 5th, originally the operation was going to happen June 5th, but bad weather set in. So the night before the D-Day landing, you have 8,000 British and 13,000 American paratroopers that drop in behind enemy lines. And their objective is to take control of bridges and roads that kind of close in and are led to the beaches. So their job is to make sure that if anybody tries to come reinforce these areas, that we hold them off. Well, there's one big problem that the Allies have: heavy cloud cover. This meant that paratroopers can't see all their landing sites, so they're landing in the wrong areas. Not to mention, the Germans have flooded some of these fields. They've put obstacles in the fields, and some of these paratroopers are getting caught in the fields and they're drowning. And 1/3 of all the glider troops are killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. So it's kind of a mess. Guys are just kind of everywhere. Now, one of the things that they had were these little clickers. You couldn't, if you got separated from your unit and you didn't, it's dark outside, you couldn't tell who was out there. You would have this little clicker, and it would click, 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 and then that way, if somebody clicked back, you knew that was your friend. Otherwise, everybody would be shooting at each other, and they wouldn't even know that they were shooting at their own friends. So that was one of the Allies' ways of trying to differentiate between German and American. Now, the German panzer divisions that are kind of sitting back and waiting for their orders to move, they can't really tell if this is just a diversionary attack, attack just to kind of keep them occupied while the main attack happens elsewhere. So they're not really moving to engage this as fully as they probably should. So there's a couple of mistakes that are happening first off as the D-Day invasion starts. Number one, there are 4 German panzer divisions that cannot move without Hitler's direct order. Sadly, the Fuhrer is asleep in his nice little house in the Austrian Alps. And so no one's going to wake him up, even when the attack starts. No one's saying anything to him. And Rommel, also getting the weather reports, had read from the weather reports that the weather was going to be too bad. It was going to be really poor weather. So therefore, he was like, well, if it's going to be poor weather, there's not going to be an invasion. And so he left, went back to Germany so that he could celebrate his wife's birthday party. What a loving man. But one of the things that Rommel often said was that the first 24 to 48 hours would be the most crucial part of this invasion, and he is nowhere to be found during it. So, give you an idea of what the beaches are looking like. You've got the Normandy beaches that are Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, and just kind of details who's landing where. Now, the U.S. objective is to cut off and capture the key port of Cherbourg so that American and Allied troops can land at that port instead of these. They've built some floating ports, but if you can capture a port town, you'd rather use that. And so that's what the U.S. objective is. Now, Gold, Juno, and Sword, again, have been taken by the Canadians and the British, and their objective is to capture the city of Caen. So if you're looking at the map right there, and you can look down, you see the 6th British Airborne Division. They've kind of dropped out to the right of Caen. But that little gray blotch right there is the city of Caen. And they're expected to capture this within a day. In reality, it takes about 7 weeks for them to get out of this area and get to Caen. And a lot of this has to do with hedgerows. And hedgerows were, imagine instead of seeing fences between your yards, these big bushes that separated your yards. And these things were 10 feet tall. You couldn't see through them. And so Germans would hide in them and fight like crazy. So that's really slowed the advance. So on the day that it starts, the U.S. starts off first. The Americans land at Utah and Omaha. Now, only 100 Germans are defending the Utah beach. And if you've ever been to Utah Beach, it's not a very big beach. You're talking maybe a 40-yard run to the embankment, and then you're up. So not a long way to go. Now, the Omaha beach was a little bit bigger. The beach itself is a lot longer, but from the bank to the water, from the top of from like the embankment, the seawall to the water, you're looking at probably about 80 to 100 yard run, maybe. So substantially bigger. Not to mention, there's about 1,000 battle-hardened soldiers there waiting on you, manning all their positions. Now, if you guys have ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, you guys are looking at Omaha Beach. Now, they called it Bloody Omaha for a very good reason. We lost about 2,400 men there, and the sector, there's actually everything was kind of broken up into sectors. And the sector that you're looking at with Tom Hanks and them just getting mutilated, I believe is the Dog Green sector. And those guys, I think the stats were they lost about 3/4 of their men trying to take the beach. I mean, they just got absolutely put through the meat grinder. An hour later, British and Canadian troops will land on Sword, Juno, and Gold. The Canadians suffer heavy losses once again. They actually lose 20 out of their 24 landing craft, and yeah, it's pretty catastrophic for the Canadians and the Americans, but they're still able to take the beaches. Now here comes German mistake number 3, and this is actually where we're going to stop for today. At 9 a.m. in the Alps, Hitler's awoken, and he's briefed that 2 massive fleets are bearing down on Calais. Well, that's not right. It's in Normandy. But the information that he's being fed is that Normandy is a diversion. And the reason why he's being told this is that British planes are dropping what's called window and it's basically just these little tin foil pieces. Well, the radar at the time picked all that stuff up. So when they flew over, they would drop all these tinfoil pieces, kind of like confetti, and the radar would pick it up, and it made it seem like there was a massive fleet on its way over from Dover. So the Germans were like, "Oh my gosh, no, it's happening! They're going to attack Calais." So everybody was kind of frozen right now. Nobody was doing anything because they didn't really know if the attack was the diversion or not. And additionally, Allied planes are also dropping fake paratroopers inland. So German troops that are supposed to be reinforcements are rushing over to capture these American and British paratroopers, only to find out it's basically a bag of sand that looks like a body. And so they're called Ruperts. And this is another effort to confuse the Germans because the idea is that if we keep dropping these out, then the Germans are just going to be like, well, it's probably just more fake dummies, when in fact it's the real thing. So that is actually where we're going to stop right now, and then we will touch base when basically with all roads leading to Cannes on Friday. So stay tuned for your assignments. I'll be posting them on RenWeb and Edmodo. So have a good day, guys, and happy Easter.